Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue. I hope you enjoyed the Texas barbecue. I will not reintroduce Aaron David Miller, who's very well known to us. I introduced him this morning. But I've asked Aaron to give his perceptions on this whole issue of the possibility of peace negotiations and the various considerations, both domestic and in the region. So the floor is Aaron's.
Thank you very much. What I really want to do is to identify a number of observations. I guess I would put them in the lessons learned category. And I will say at the outset that I'm a historian by training. I actually am a real historian, although I never practiced. I wrote one serious history book and then got diverted onto a highway, and I never really got off. But I'm embarrassed to say that in 25 years of government, I made this point to former Secretary Baker many times, that I probably could not identify more than 2 or 3 moments when I actually employed history in the service of either making a point or rejecting one. And that is a very serious mistake, frankly. It's a very serious mistake. History teaches humility. It teaches a degree of perspective that is critically important for a great power, and it is when great powers ignore 2 transgressions that they get themselves into trouble, either when it involves war making, where the costs are very, very high, or peacemaking, where the costs are less high, but failure, as I indicated earlier, is very consequential. There's a cost for failing. We live by this quintessentially American notion that trying and failing is better than not trying at all. I mean, I love that notion. When we briefed Bill Clinton in July of 2000 in the run-up to the Camp David summit, at the end of the second briefing, he turned to us and said, you know, trying and failing is much more important than not trying at all. And I was really motivated, even though I thought the prospects for success were that somewhat remote. But I've subsequently understood, and I'll touch on this when I talk about the U.S. role, that failure has a consequence. Trying and failing may, in fact, be better than not trying at all, may be a useful slogan for a high school or a college football team, but it is not a substitute for a foreign policy of the greatest country on earth. And I don't care whether you're talking Syria, where I've been extremely cautious in terms of what I would argue we should be doing or not doing, Arab-Israeli, or certainly the projection of American military force, which we really need to look at history. You know, if I were to ask you the question, how many Americans were killed during the American occupation of Japan? We occupied Japan from 1945 to 1953. Circumstances are totally different than Iraq and Afghanistan. You know the answer to that question? How many Americans were actually killed in hostile acts by Japanese during that entire period? The answer is none. Not 10, 20, 50, 0. So I have to ask myself the question, what is it that we were thinking when we decided to launch this discretionary war in Iraq, appropriately this week, 10th anniversary? And the pundits, myself included, are adding up the balance sheets, but I can't justify. However good the Iraqi story ultimately becomes, I can't justify the sacrifice that was made. I don't see how anybody could. When we act politically or militarily, we need to ask ourselves 2 fundamental questions. Not just can we do it, but what is it going to cost? That's why history is important. And when great powers cross 2 thresholds, 2 transgressions, when they commit sins of omniscience, they think they know everything, and they commit the sin of omnipotence, they think they can do everything, things get really, really complicated. So history is important, and when it comes to Arab-Israeli peacemaking, it's, I would argue, less consequential than wars, certainly. The costs are less, but still important. Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And I think he's right. I'm not entirely sure what he meant by that, but it's the rhythmic patterns It's not the strict repetitions. It's the rhythmic patterns that need to be paid attention to. So, you know, as we approach another round of what I am persuaded will be a reasonably proactive American role, how proactive is unclear. I think we need to keep certain things in mind, and I'm going to just make a few observations in the sense of reminding us. Number one, success in our enterprise in the Arab-Israeli arena is rare. It just doesn't happen a lot. 50 years of American diplomacy, give or take a few. And we have had, that is to say the United States, has been involved in a critical way in only 3 successes. 3 in 50 years. And I'll identify them for you. One is Kissinger's disengagement diplomacy following the 1973 October War. He brokered in the space of 18 months, which was a truly extraordinary accomplishment, which is why he's the other most consequential Secretary of State, other than Jim Baker, in the last 50 years. 2 disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt. One laid the basis for what would become a political breakthrough and lead to a peace treaty, and one between Israel and Syria, signed on June 1st, 1974, which still governs the relationship between a collapsing Assad regime and the government of Israel. For how long is unclear. People are very increasingly worried about what is going to happen to the Golan Heights and that agreement. That's number one. Second, Jimmy Carter, a Democratic president who brokered 2 agreements, a Camp David summit in September of 1978 and an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Only 4 American presidents out of 11 since the State of Israel was created actually visited Israel while in office. By the way, that's another rarity. Presidents don't go to Israel routinely. Only 4 have gone. And Nixon, in a very strange visit, Carter, Clinton 4 times, and Bush 43 twice. So that was the second breakthrough. And the third was Jim Baker's effort in the run-up, in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, to broker a 3-day peace conference, Madrid, in October 1991. That's it. Those are the only 3 times in 50 years that the Americans have been involved in brokering consequential agreements between Israelis and Arabs. Now, we participated in many other enterprises. The Israelis and Jordanians went off and did their own negotiation in a peace treaty, as Yair Hirschfeld knows very well. Israelis and Palestinians also, in a heroic effort, tried to go off and do their own thing in the Oslo Accords. And we, between 1996 and 1999, brokered 2 additional agreements, neither of which were fully implemented. But the Oslo process collapsed, essentially, and has not yet recovered. Neither has the Israeli-Palestinian relationship from that collapse. So peacemaking is rare, and there's a reason for that, because it's unbelievably hard. And I think the president acknowledged that on the trip. I talked to I guess it was the Israeli consul or from the consul's office outside, and we talked about the moonshot. We were able to do that because we had it totally under our control. The Arab-Israeli issue has so many moving parts, and today it's more complicated than ever, that it's extremely hard. When we succeed, and I'll bring my next observation, we really always have the benefit of leaders who are masters of their political spaces, not prisoners of them. Whether it was Begin or Rabin or even Arafat in his first incarnation, or King Hussein, strong leaders were able to take risks and invest in partners who were prepared to some degree, recognize their reciprocal interests. Without leadership, and I know I'm being very redundant here, it's hard for me to imagine, because Arab-Israeli peacemaking is an existential enterprise. It's not like being turned out of office. Rabin and Sadat were murdered. as a direct consequence of the risk they chose to take. Arafat said to us at Camp David, I heard him say it 4 times, that you will not walk behind my coffin, which essentially meant you will not get a chance to attend my funeral. And Clinton showed them the very cabin where Sadat and Begin had negotiated. And Sadat, as I mentioned earlier, got a pretty extraordinary deal. There were no compromises, no swaps, none of that. He got Sinai back and all Jewish settlements dismantled. And he was murdered for it. And that was a good deal. So you need leaders because Arab-Israeli peacemaking is existential, and it's incredibly hard. And leaders who have will, who have motivation, who have capacity. I mean, if I were to tell you that between 1920 and 1950, 6 men were responsible for most of the death and destruction and devastation, as well as prospects for peace and prosperity for most of the Western world, it's a stunning testament to the power of individuals to affect reality and millions of lives for good or for ill. And you need it to overcome these obstacles, even under the best of circumstances. You truly need it. And with all due respect, it's hard for me to look at the current circumstances and see a lot of strong leaders. I just don't see it. I would even defy any of you to look at the United Nations, 193 countries. I have a hard time identifying one leader that represents any of those nations that I would consider to be transformative. I briefed a group of military officers the other day, and I asked them, they're 10 years younger than I am, all combat vets. And I said, who was the last American that you would attach the label great to? And I gave them 5 minutes to think about it. They couldn't come up with one, not one, in their lifetimes. I said, I have one for you. And they said, who? I said, Martin Luther King. And one of them said, well, but he died in 1968. And I said, exactly. That's exactly the point. That issue of leadership is really critical. Number 3, you need a degree of urgency that creates enough incentive and disincentive for the leader to want to act. It is the combination of gain and pain, gain plus pain, that impels and has impelled Arabs and Israelis in the past to take the decisions that they have been reluctant to take under normal, ordinary circumstances. It was the October War and the costs and opportunities that led to 3 disengagement agreements. It was Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in November of 1977 and the prospective gain following the pain that created a process that ended in an Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And it was the pain and gain of the first Gulf War, which allowed the United States, for a brief moment, to emerge as an unassailable, truly acknowledged great power. And there was a price to say no to Bush 41 and Jim Baker. There really was a price and a cost. And even if there really wasn't, those two created the image and the illusion that, in fact, there might be a price. And I mentioned earlier, people say no to America these days without cost or without consequence. Our street cred in that part of the world is way down. The Pew polls suggest it. They truly do in terms of the American image. And I would argue it's because we are not succeeding. We really are not succeeding. And that is a real problem, because most successful peacemaking, when it involves the Americans, is done not at a time of diminished credibility, but at a time of rising power. And I'm not entirely sure that, even though I don't accept the fact that I'm not a declinist, I think that there is a serious issue in terms of our competency and our credibility particularly in this part of the world. Part of it has to do with Iraq and Afghanistan, the two longest wars in American history, where the price for victory was never could we win, but when could we leave? And extrication, the act of leaving, is not the metric that you want to use as a performance standard to judge the success or failure of the greatest power on earth. And that has diminished our credibility, even though from a military point of view, it is the military as an institution that has been most effective. But unless tied to a political strategy that allows you to secure gains once you depart, military power, after all, is just an instrument to achieve a set of objectives. If your capacity is not as strong as the objectives or aligned with the objectives you want to achieve, you have a dysfunction which could only lead to failure. So urgency is really important, and frankly, I know that the situation is bad. It's horrible in this part of the world among Israelis and Palestinians, but I just don't see that kind of urgency. I don't see the prospects of gain or the prospects of pain applied in a way that would force either the current Prime Minister of Israel and his coalition or the President of the Palestinian Authority, let alone Hamas, to make these kinds of decisions. Now, it's an annoyingly negative analysis. I concede that. But it's based on what I see. Groucho Marx, one of our preeminent philosophers, said, "Who are you going to believe in Duck Soup?" He said, "Me? Are you going to believe me? Or are you going to believe your lying eyes?" What am I supposed to do? Pretend that I don't see what I see? No, I can't do that. I pretended for too long. And on the basis of that pretending, I ended up offering advice that frankly was not well-timed or well-measured. When we briefed the President of the United States in the run-up to Camp David, he went around the table and he asked everybody whether they thought he or she should go to the summit. I was the most junior person at that table, and I was the last to speak. And everybody before me said, "Mr. President, you have to go. There's an opportunity. Trying and failing is better than not trying at all. No one will understand if you don't go. It's the last 6 months of your administration." He came to me, and I knew exactly what I should have said. I should have said, "Mr. President, go to Camp David, but listen to what I'm going to tell you. You will not reach an agreement there. Arafat is not ready to make these decisions. Barak may be generous, but he's asking too much for a conflict-ending agreement, and you, frankly, and we are not ready for this. We're not ready to take charge of this summit. We don't know enough about the issues. You're not prepared to put formal bridging proposals on the table, particularly if they alienate the Israelis." But I didn't say any of that. None of it. I got up and said exactly what everybody else said. I regret it. And I'm not going to let it happen again. Seed 0, dark 30, okay? But for one reason only. Fictitious, over-exaggerated, or over-represented. The kind of public servants you want working for you is Maya or her fictional or real equivalent. You want somebody who's prepared to challenge authority in the interests of the Republic. It's really important. So let me conclude with one observation about the American role. I am not ideologically, metaphysically, morally opposed to a robust American role to help Israelis and Palestinians resolve this issue. They will not do this by themselves. The notion that somehow you're going to have a successor Oslo process that's going to, this time under the Turks or the Swedes, and with Yair and Ron Pundak driving the process. I would only hope so, but it's not going to happen. Things have changed, the region has changed, the Israelis and the Palestinians have changed. It's not that I object to the role, but the dividing line for our foreign policy should not be between left and right, liberal and conservative, Democrat or Republican. It should be between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And which side of the line do we want to be on? Let's help broker an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, but let's be smart about it. And being smart about it first acknowledges what needs to be done and the price that needs to be paid to do this. It means having a president and a secretary of state who are prepared to be tough, who are prepared to bear the domestic political consequences, who are prepared to risk, and who are prepared to also be reassuring about what the parties need. Toughness is not enough. Vinegar is not enough. You need generous applications of vinegar and honey if you want to succeed. So absolutely, let's get involved. But let's do it in a way that minimizes the chances of failure and maximizes the chances of success. One final point. Jack Kennedy, the first and last president that ever had a real emotional impact on me, I was 12 when he was assassinated, once described himself as an idealist without illusion. I love that phrase. Idealism without illusion. I stole it from him. I describe myself that way. I think America should look at the world that way. I think the Israelis and Palestinians should look at the world that way too. Never, ever give up on the prospects that the world can be changed, people can be changed. But as you go through this process of transaction and transformation, at least go through it with your eyes wide open. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I love that phrase, idealist without illusion. There's a lot of truth to that. Okay, now it's my pleasure to go into the second major subject that we're going to be discussing. You see, we picked two very easy issues for today's conference, Israel, Palestine, and Syria. So it's my pleasure to invite Hala now to the table, but we first have to get her a chair. So we moved the. Thank you. You could start from here, yes. and then
but I would love to have Robin, our third panelist. Oh, wait. Can someone get her? Yes. I would need a glass of water. Okay. Yeah, I think she came late. Went to have a bite to eat, so we need her. Okay. Yes, please, Fred. Thank you for coming. Our third panelist is going to join us, I'm sure, momentarily. When I was sitting there, I looked at the table. I counted 3 chairs, 3 signs, and I said, maybe I'm not seeing well. Put on my glasses, counted 3 chairs and 3 signs. So I thought to myself, well, I'm a Middle Easterner, I'm a Middle Eastern woman. I have to be present, but also be invisible. So then I was trying to figure out how can I be invisible, and there was no way. So I then told Ed, I think you are missing a seat for me somewhere there. Anyway, good afternoon. And we heard this morning the Israel-Palestinian, about the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and we also had a keynote speaker about the process of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking and lessons learned. This afternoon, we will cover one of the 2 most pressing issues the Middle East is facing today. Syria, which we are going to cover, and of course, as you know, the other issue is Iran's nuclear problem. Luckily for me, we are not going to cover Iran, but I'm sure Iran will come up in the discussion over Syria. 2 years into the uprising, millions of Syrian refugees and displaced people, destruction of cities, beautiful cities that a lot of us remember, and also, you know, a president that is not willing to give up, Bashar Assad, an opposition cannot even agree on a leader, and then a conflict that has outside players, Iran, Russia, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, these are the official players, and of course, Al-Qaeda, the Islamists, and all sorts of other, Hezbollah, all sorts of other groups. In order to unravel this big mystery, we have a wonderful group of speakers. We start with Fred Hoff, who is a senior fellow with the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Ambassador Hoff was previously the special advisor for transition in Syria and the special coordinator for regional affairs in the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Special Envoy for the Middle East Peace. He also, and I'm going to skip everybody's long bio, but he is also the author of Galilee Divided, the Israeli-Lebanon Frontier, 1916 to 1984, Line of Battle, Border of Peace, The Line of June 4, 1967, and Beyond the Boundary, Lebanon, Israel, and the Challenge of Change in the Middle East. Our second speaker is going to be Robin Wright, who is currently a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace and the Wilson Center's Distinguished Scholar. During her fellowship at the center, she has worked on 3 books: Rock the Kasbah, Rage and Rebellion Across the Islamic World, the Iran Primer, Power and Politics and U.S. Policy, and the Islamists Are Coming, Who They Really Are. The Primer and the Islamists are constantly being updated on the USIP and the Wilson Center website, and both are visited by thousands and thousands of hits almost on a monthly basis. So it has been one of the 2 most, both have been very successful endeavors taken by Robin, and her Rock the Kasbah and her previous books have been also bestsellers. Robin has been a journalist, and she has covered almost the whole world. Aaron was telling her this morning, I went 2 weeks ago to South Africa and for 2 days, and what an amazing country. Robin said, I lived there 7 years. So, and then we have, of course, with us Andrew Bowen, who is the Baker Institute Scholar for the Middle East, and he has previously served as the contributing editor of Al-Majalla and is a contributing writer for the magazine, where he publishes, among other pieces, the weekly blog Ibn Dawood. I have to ask him why he decided Ibn Dawood, and because there is no similarity between Andrew and Dawood. So whatever, maybe your father? David? Yeah, okay, now I understood. We are delighted to have him with us. Our 4th panelist, Adel Al-Turaifi, is missing. I was told that he had to meet with his editor-in-chief in London. Ambassador Hoff, you have the floor.
Hala, thank you very much for the invitation, or for the introduction. Ed, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be very brief, and what I'll try to do very modestly is set the stage for a follow-on discussion here. There is no way, I think, that any of us in the space of 10 or 15 minutes can do full justice to the problem we're facing in Syria. This is literally a problem from hell. There are many, many, many moving parts here, virtually all of which are beyond the power of the United States to influence decisively. Anybody who tells you that there is a single silver bullet that can make this right, whether it's a no-fly zone or something like that, literally does not know what he's talking about. There may be ways where the United States can influence the trajectory of things around the edges, but unfortunately, things are at the point now where there is no combination of things or countries that is going to bring about a micromanaged, engineered solution to what's happening in Syria. This is more a matter of mitigating potential disastrous consequences, many of which we're already getting a sample of now, than it is of imposing cosmic solutions. I thought what I would restrict my remarks to then is basically three questions centered on U.S. policy. First of all, what is the objective and the strategy of the President of the United States with respect to Syria? Second, why is it that this strategy is encountering difficulties? And third, what changes are under consideration? Now, those of you who may have some familiarity with the writing I've done for the Atlantic Council know that I have some views about some of these issues. I'm going to go very light in terms of prescription. I think the best thing I can do is try to give an accurate understanding of the choices the President is facing here, none of which are easy. And of course, we'll hear from my former colleague and ongoing good friend Robert Ford later on, and he'll give you the official administration view. This is what you'll hear from me is slightly less than official, but I hope reasonably accurate. First of all, what is the President's objective and strategy with regard to Syria? The objective, which has been stated in many different places, is a peaceful, measured, political transition from Assad family rule to something better, something ideally incorporating the notions of citizenship, trumping all other aspects of political identification, rule of law, civil society, etc. The objective is a negotiated transition of power from Assad to something else. Why is this strategy encountering the strategy, incidentally, is to support the efforts of Lakhdar Brahimi, who is the successor to Kofi Annan in trying to arrange a political transition. Last June in Geneva, under the chairmanship of Kofi Annan, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council reached agreement on an outline for negotiations to take place. Basically, what this would involve is negotiations between a team put together by the Syrian opposition, a team designated by President Assad, which would attempt to form a sort of national unity government. This government would be formed on the basis of mutual consent, meaning that each side had the right to veto personalities offered by the other side. This was deemed by us as something absolutely essential for the opposition to make sure that neither Assad nor any of his henchmen would be playing a role in the future governance of Syria. This national unity government, also known as a transitional governing mechanism, would then, according to this formula, receive full executive powers from the Syrian regime. Now, it's important to note that when we negotiated this, we decided to avoid any kind of precondition that Assad step down and leave the country before negotiations were to take place. We knew it was going to be an extraordinarily difficult sell to the Syrian opposition to come to the table. But we felt the Russians had a rather heavy diplomatic lift ahead of them also, because their job was going to be to, in essence, deliver Bashar al-Assad to his own political funeral. Because our sense was that if this mechanism came into effect, if it received full executive powers, it was highly unlikely that Bashar al-Assad would hang around Damascus to sample what transitional justice might be like in Syria without any executive powers of his own. Now, why is this strategy encountering difficulty? The basic reason is that the primary object of the strategy, Bashar al-Assad, is not cooperating with it. He has demonstrated absolutely no interest in a negotiation. His last meeting with Lakhdar Brahimi was spectacularly unpleasant from the point of view of Mr. Brahimi. He was subjected to a good deal of insulting, arrogant behavior. And what seems to be behind this is a calculation by Bashar al-Assad that he need not negotiate, that he has prospects for winning on the ground. Some observers attribute this to delusional behavior. Others say that he's doing the arithmetic, looking at the extent of the support he's getting from Iran and Hezbollah, and has decided that he can actually put this genie back in the bottle. Something I personally consider to be, among the most unlikely things that will happen on this planet. Nevertheless, this is his calculation right now. So we have a new Secretary of State who has basically gone to the president and said, Mr. President, your objective is a worthy one, but we have a basic problem here, and what we are going to have to do is try to change Mr. Assad's calculation, to try to put him in a situation where he would agree to negotiations. Secretary Kerry has approached this basically in two directions. He has attempted, he's done his best to support Lakhdar Brahimi in bringing the Russians back into this process. To the best of my knowledge, that is not working at all. Again, variety of theories out there for Russian unwillingness to support this process. What most of the observable data seem to indicate is that any prospect of progress here with the Russians stops cold when it reaches the level of President Putin. And again, there are a variety of theories for that. Perhaps we can get into that in the discussion phase. The other thing that Secretary of State Kerry has done, and obviously he's not a free agent here, he's doing this at the direction, or at least with the consent of the President of the United States, is to open up a direct relationship with the Syrian armed opposition. Now, the only thing I would like to say about this particular subject is that quite often the issue is boiled down to the words "arm the opposition." Okay? It's actually, it may actually not involve that, but it could involve much more than that in some senses. There is the sense that changing Assad's calculation is going to be extraordinarily difficult under any circumstances. There is a high likelihood that a result in Syria is going to be produced at the end of the day by ground combat, right? So what the United States is doing at this point is opening this relationship through the Supreme Military Council, an organ that was created a few months ago. It is headed by a fellow named Salim Idris, a Syrian general who left Syria not all that long ago. By all accounts, a pretty impressive guy. Now, we've all heard of the Free Syrian Army. For those of you who served in the military, this is unlike any army you may have been remotely familiar with in the past. We're not talking about chain of command. We're not talking about command and control. Ironically, one of the reasons the Syrian revolution has not been killed in the cradle is the fact that it is quite disorganized. Okay? Nevertheless, even as one fights through this revolution, attention has to be paid to what kind of Syria is going to come into existence afterwards. General Idris is trying his best to bring some kind of order to this chaos. It is not easy. What all of these Free Syrian Army people have in common are needs. They need the kind of food and medical kits that are on offer from the United States. Where they get this support from is going to obviously have great importance in terms of who has influence, who can direct. So my sense is that we are trying to empower General Idris to the maximum so that people on the ground know that things are coming from him. I think the most difficult issue facing the administration right now is one of what really to do with the Syrian opposition. We have the Syrian opposition coalition that was created back in November, recognized by the United States and others in December as the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people. A coalition that has actually just named a prime minister, a Texan, by the name of Hassan Hitto, a person who is known to the United States government, a person of a technocrat, a person of some ability, as I understand it, somebody who has actually been able to get humanitarian assistance through into Syria to people who need it. I think the real question that's going to face us over the next few months is whether or not we are going to work with this opposition and encourage this opposition to establish an alternate government on Syrian territory in liberated areas of Syria. Okay? As of now, even though this opposition coalition does have some roots inside the country, it is not exclusively a collection of exiles hanging around the better hotels of Europe. It is still not a government on Syrian territory. What millions of Syrians are still looking for, including my closest Syrian friends, and I started in this business as a 16-year-old exchange student in Damascus, and I will tell you that my two Syrian brothers, although they have absolutely no illusions about the incompetence and the brutality and the corruption of the Assad regime. This is a Catholic family, and they're worried about what comes next. And even though the leader of the Syrian opposition coalition wrote and published an absolutely beautiful letter to the Christians of Syria, even so, he is still the leader of an opposition that has no real standing, legal or otherwise, inside Syria. So if there is going to be an alternative, a living, breathing alternative that's going to reach out to people like my Syrian family, it's got to be something on the ground in Syria, actually governing, actually operating, actually standing for the kinds of principles that can attract Syrian minorities. But for this to happen, and this is my central point, this would require a fundamental paradigm shift in American strategy. Keep in mind what Aaron said this morning. The President of the United States needs this problem like a hole in the head. His priorities are domestic. To the extent he wishes to make a foreign policy impact, he wants it to be in East Asia and Pacific. He has invested a good deal of time and energy getting us out of Iraq, and he's trying to get us out of Afghanistan. And now people like me are coming to him and saying, look, a different approach is needed to Syria. This is not Iraq. Holding Syria at arm's length seems to be the essence of conservatism and prudence, until you realize that by the end of this year, there could be 4 million or more Syrian refugees in the surrounding countries. We could easily be at the point where our friends and allies in the region are howling for our leadership. It's starting now, okay? It's not as if we can just hold this problem at arm's length. But I did want to give you, a sense of the difficulty the President has in trying to figure out a way forward. And for those of you who are interested in following this over the next few months, I would pay close attention to the evolution of this Syrian opposition coalition and the relationship of the United States government to it. Because for us to actively support the establishment of a government in Syria means we may well have to be involved in the defense of that government. We will certainly have to be involved in organizing financial support for that government. We are going to have to do an enormous amount of work with people on the ground advising and assisting that government. And again, this is not a matter of trying to micromanage an outcome in Syria. It's a matter of trying to prevent the worst from happening. And I'm afraid it doesn't get much better than that, but these are the choices facing the President.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Ed, for inviting us here. I always am happy to follow Fred. We were based in Beirut together in the early 1980s. I have been assigned the unenviable task of looking at the regime, why it's survived, and what happens next, what its strategy is, and how it is trying to craft some control of its exit. So I like to think in formulas, and so I've come up with a 7-point formula, both to understand how the regime has lasted this long, what its strategy is, and where it stands on those 7 points, because that helps us then make an evaluation of how much longer it may last. What are the issues that most have to be dealt with? So the first is that the regime is held on to power because of what's called the 30% rule. Dictators never need to have the majority, but they have to have at least 30% in order to stay in power. And Daddy Assad particularly managed to craft a coalition that tapped into the 30%, which are based on not only the minorities, the Christians, the Alawites, the Druze, but also to build a kind of a corrupt branch of society, those who were so integrated into the system that they had a vested interest in seeing it survived. That was particularly true of certain commercial interests, particularly in Aleppo. That was one of the reasons that in the early days everyone said, well, you know, Aleppo won't fall. Well, today we see Aleppo in real trouble. So that's one of the ways that the regime has stayed in power for 43 years. The second is divide and rule, and it did this very effectively. Muammar Gaddafi did the same thing, facilitated by the demographics. Syria is the strategic center of the Middle East, but it is also the most divided of the 22 Arab countries when it comes to sectarian, ethnic, and tribal differences. And the tribes are something we're all having to learn again because we're so used to kind of focusing on one power center and one individual, and now we're seeing the range. Daddy Assad, again, was very good at manipulating the different sectors of society, weakening them to the point that they were dependent on his regime. The third is economic independence and control. And remember, Baathism was a socialist ideology, and it created a bloated bureaucracy that provided a lot of jobs. One of my favorite jokes about it's not even a joke, but it's kind of a reflection on life in Damascus, was that people would go into work in the morning, put their coat on the table, go out to get coffee, and they'd come back at 5 o'clock to pick up their coats on their way home. A lot of them didn't really have jobs. And Assad also took it, Daddy Assad particularly took advantage of the oil boom in the mid-'80s, which provided for the first time some revenue from oil export, and this gave them a kind of false cushion for a while. The fourth reason was that the government was able to isolate its own society from the outside world. There was not only government control over the state, over state-controlled media, but there was also state control over the religious authority. There was one truth, whether it was religious or social or political. The fifth factor was obviously security forces and having the arms, the commitment, and the manpower, estimated 300,000, in order to enforce your will. And anybody who's been in Damascus knows that the secret police are everywhere. There's nothing you can do without being monitored. And so, and when your strategy is based on the ends justifies the means, anything goes, and that was critical in enforcement. The sixth factor is that for most particularly of Hafez al-Assad's rule, Syria fit in with the global models, the global trends. That you had a period of the Cold War. Baathism and socialism had a place. It had natural political allies. It fit in with the kind of world's dividing line. And the last one, of course, was that it had enough allies to bestow legitimacy. Syria was so important in the Arab League. I remember going to a conference the Arab League organized in the early 1980s in Fez, and this was to introduce the FAD plan, which was the first one that offered the idea of a peace deal with Israel. And this was critical. Crown Prince Fahd had invested enormous capital in rallying the Arab world to support this. This was going to be a turning point. And what happened was that all the leaders arrived, and we were all waiting for the Syrians. And then the Syrian plane arrived with Assad's bodyguards and his staff, but Assad never arrived, and the Fez summit collapsed. And it was only after Israel's invasion of Lebanon, they had another Fez summit, they realized the Arab world was weakened, and the Saudi king, using some checkbook diplomacy, managed to get Assad there. But this is a country that was the centerpiece. You couldn't move, you couldn't make any political decision without Syria. And so it had allies not only in the world, but it was really tremendously important. So 43 years after the Assad dynasty took power, and 2 years after the uprising, where do we stand on all 7 points? And that, again, offers us some kind of barometer of where things are headed and what the outcome might be and when. First of all, the 30% rule. I think we've reached that point that we're at or just below 30% for the first time, that you have the minority support eroding in multiple ways, a lot of more people sitting on the fence, not willing to actively support. That's reflected in particularly one of the later factors in rallying enough troops to your side. And it's eroding not just because of the uprising, but because of a basic fact that Hafez al-Assad was a visionary. You may have disagreed with what he proposed. You may have disagreed with Baathism, but he did have a vision in terms of creating strategic parity between Israel and the Arabs. And his son, being not the intended heir apparent, was a weak leader. And there's a kind of rule of thumb about weak leaders. They can often be the most dangerous because they're not willing to take the gambles, the big steps. We see that play out today in Iran as well, where Ayatollah Khomeini, the revolutionary leader, was prepared to take some very bold steps, particularly in ending the war with Iraq, and his successor, a weak man, put there in part because others in the system wanted to build more of a republic than an Islamic government, put a weak leader in place who's not prepared to take the bold steps. So we're getting to the point that the 30% is at or below. And I think probably I'd put it in the early 20% if I were trying to kind of amass where things stand in terms of solid support behind the government. The second is the divide and rule. And this is where it backfired under a weaker leader. That it's been striking how 74% of the Syria's population is Sunni. Now, there are tribal and ethnic divides, but there is that stronger sense of Sunni identity than there ever was, I think, under Hafez al-Assad. And I think that's been a rallying point in terms of support for the opposition, supporting an alternative to Assad. I think it's eroded his rule, in part because he bet too much on the kind of Shiite identity, the Shiite crescent, his Shiite allies, whether in Iran or Lebanon. The third factor is the economy, and this really is critically important. I covered not only South Africa, but the end of the Soviet Union, and one of the end of military dictatorships in Latin America. And one of the things that's really striking is the fact that the key turning point in all of those was really the economic reality, that the government couldn't afford apartheid anymore, that communism really was not a viable ideology in a globalizing world. And I think we're reaching that point that the economics of what's happening in Syria are not explored or understood enough. And it plays out on a lot of different levels. The oil boom, the brief oil boom in Syria, had already begun to decline. And Syria made a classic mistake. It did not use those years of some oil money to develop industry. It did not use the income. It actually allowed it to replace the kind of industrial base, and a lot of the industries atrophied. And so as oil declines, as there has not been much to replace it. And then, of course, you had sanctions imposed on oil exports, and 95% of the oil exports went to Europe, and Europe imposed its unilateral sanctions on oil exports from Syria when the UN refused to move. So they faced that, the kind of double whammy of their own decline in oil production and sanctions. Then you have the overall impact of various types of sanction. The reality is, in terms of facts, inflation is now 40%. The economy has shrunk 20%. The Syrian pound has been halved in value. There are reports, and this is a lot of anecdotal information, so we don't know how true it is to what extent it is, but that families who are paying off the regime so that their sons don't have to join the military are providing significant funds needed to pay the bill. And so there are kind of, that's what trouble the regime is in. And so it's much more vulnerable on that count than I think we fully appreciate. The fourth factor is this isolation, and again, for a lot of different reasons, the regime can no longer control the message. And this is true whether it's because of technology and the internet and the fact that you have a savvy young generation that's plugged in, can get resources even when the regime jams internet outlets. I lived in Beirut during Hama in 1982, and there were anywhere from 10 to 25,000 people killed over a 3-week period, and none of us could get in until after it happened and to see the kind of wreckage, but we didn't have a scope. Today you get almost hourly through technology reports of what's happening. So the message, there is today another Syria. Before we had one image, one message coming out of Syria, and there's today multiple Syrias. The fifth factor is security forces. And Syria, clearly, the government still clearly has the numbers. The defections have not reached a critical point. It has the advantage in arms, particularly in the air, and tanks and artillery. It has the Shabiha, the paramilitary forces that it has used in all kinds of operations against the protesters. But it's a really interesting shift, particularly in, I think, the last few months, maybe 3 or 4 months, that you see in terms of military tactics, that troops are not as, and I don't know at what level the decision is being made, but that that troops that were once deployed well beyond their territory into new and different places are now, for whatever reasons, whether there's a sense of fear that they'll defect or that they may not do their jobs, they're being deployed more to protect the neighborhoods from which they come rather than being deployed in territories that they don't know, that the regime is very self-conscious about where it deploys its troops. There are also many areas, even though the rebels don't control huge chunks of territory, where the government may have control during the day, but there's a sense that the opposition is a player at night. And so that when you look at a map and who has control of what turf, it isn't always quite straightforward, and there's a growing sense that the opposition may be doing better. This is an asymmetric war, and Fred said he thought that this would be settled on the battlefield. I'm not sure. I think we are, at least at the moment, at a point where the rebels can't win it, but the government can't either. And that, as in the question posed this morning, does it have to be solved by a political solution? The sixth factor is the global model. And with the end of the Cold War and the transformation in so many other parts of the world, it is clear that Syria is out of sync, both with the world and the prevalent ideologies, as well as in the region. The Arab uprisings have isolated Syria as they've never been. And finally, on allies, Syria still has Russia, for some basic reasons, not just the ports and the military sales and the fact that Syria is the only real Arab ally that Moscow has, but also for a couple of other reasons. One, the Russians want to know what's next, and that's a legitimate question that the outside world has not been able to answer sufficiently or in a way that satisfies key players at the United Nations, but also the fact that Russia has and China too, China is one of the 5 largest Muslim countries, that Russia and China, which both have vetoes, are very worried about their own Muslim populations and whether it's the Arab uprisings or what's happening in Syria, the idea that they could challenge even strong regimes. And needless to say, the interesting thing is, unlike 1982, when when Syria was the key player when it came to the peace process or whatever. Syria is today isolated by the Arab world. The Arab League has taken a very strong stand against it. And so you can see that on each one of these criteria, Syria's position has very seriously eroded. Now, just a couple of other key points. One is on this question of the opposition. And I have to say I'm much more skeptical about its viability. I'm very worried that the Syrian National Coalition and the different components in it are no better than or no stronger than the Iraqi National Congress was, which was led by an exile who hadn't been to Iraq since he was 18 and left in 1958. You know, I worry even about the good intentions, and they may have some base, but the fact is, unlike Iraq, you've had 2 years of a very strong internal political movement developing that plays out not just in the militias, at least 200 of them, but also in the revolutionary councils and the kind of secular revolutionary councils, and then the Islamic factions that are setting up their own Islamic courts and so forth. That the idea that any of these guys are going to be major players in what's next, I think I would be skeptical about. The other thing that concerns me a great deal is something that King Abdullah in Jordan said in a controversial interview this week with Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic. He talked about the Sunni crescent that is emerging. And the thing that worries me the most about what's happening in the Middle East is the deepening sectarianism across the board and how that plays out. And it's not just Sunni Shiite, it's also Sunni Sunni. And you find even among the Islamists there are increasingly deep divisions. You see Saudi Arabia providing assistance to the Salafis in Syria and Qatar supporting the Muslim Brotherhood factions. That this is a playground in which we may see not just Islamists, but a whole different array of players, some that we haven't even fully understood or identified yet in the region, in the country. And this has, because Syria is the strategic center of the region, this has profound implications for what happens in the Arab uprisings, what happens with the peace process with Israel. The only counterbalance is something that happened this morning, which is a wonderful development, and that is that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Prime Minister of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, had a telephone call in which Netanyahu apologized for the 2010 raid on the ship carrying humanitarian goods to Gaza. This is the most powerful Muslim country in the world, and this is a kind of counter. This is the kind of civilized dialogue, engagement, diplomacy, the kind of model we'd like to see play out in the region, and offers an alternative to the kind of chaotic disintegration, conflict model that Syria provides. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Robin. Andrew, please.
I just wanted to first say a few words about Ambassador Derision and I's new policy report, which entitled Syria at the Crossroads, U.S. Policy and Recommendations for the Way Forward, kind of building on some of what Fred and Robin said. Very much arming alone is not simply a strategy. And I think that without a coherent, without an organized strategy to reinforce any additional steps the United States may take, such additional steps would not be arguably as effective. And I think that particularly with what Aaron mentioned this morning about the role of the United States and I think the importance of emphasizing the multilateral opportunities, so that in case this is not something that President Obama on his own wants to take ownership for, I think it is important that when looking and examining these options and outcomes is to really think, how do we leverage the relations in the international community and regional bodies? And so that is one of the kind of overarching areas of our recommendations. And I think, but equally so, similar to Robin, we very much believe that a political solution is really the only way out. And I'm very skeptical that a military solution based on when I was in the region meeting with FSA commanders, meeting with former members of the Assad regime, senior members of the Assad military who recently defected, I don't get any clear sense that this is going to be won purely on the battlefield. And if it is to be won on the battlefield, it will be a very violent outcome. And when meeting with the United Nations and Jordan, I was also struck by how, but particularly as well, if we do end up with a violent outcome, how that impacts the minority communities and the risks of ethnic cleansing and the risk of mass human migration from Syria. So I think that those are some of the more general points on the recommendations, and we listed 11 key recommendations ranging from the drawing a red line on the chemical weapons to peacekeeping, and as well as to considering which ways can we strengthen the coalition, because very much we believe that unless the SNC takes adequate steps to really be inclusive, more inclusive of the minority communities and also former members of the Assad regime who are not affiliated with crimes, those in the Ba'ath Civil Service, this coalition cannot form a sustainable government. It could, but it probably is not one that will preserve the multi-ethnic potential democratic character of Syria. But one area I briefly want to focus on is this fact that currently the topic of the talks are kind of the crisis in Syria. But I really think, and this is a point that we try to emphasize in our recommendations in more than one point, is that this is becoming a regional crisis in the sense that the security and stability of Jordan cannot continue, must be considered or should be considered, because the longer the civil war in Syria continues, the more it will impact Jordan's stability and the vulnerability that Fred mentioned, that the refugee number may go up to 4 million. The Jordanians estimate that it's about $3,500 for care of one refugee, and it's already at 2.5 million. Not all of them are in Jordan. But if there's going to be additional 1.5 million, how does that impact the public debt crisis in Jordan? How does that impact unemployment, the issues of water? One of the underlying issues still unresolved in this area is what will be the water, how relationships between these states, and particularly as well their vulnerability, particularly to the number of people going and fighting in Syria who may come back to Jordan. And that is something to be very wary. But also two other countries that should be noted and looked at is Iraq, even though this is, yes, the 10th anniversary of the American invasion in Iraq. How the events in Syria play out will very much impact Maliki's relationship with the Sunni-dominated provinces in Iraq, and equally so the increasing links between various armed groups within Syria and Iraq. That building kind of linkages and that blurring of that border will be an important question to think about in the future. As how to, in particular for the United States and the Arab League or the GCC, how do we craft a strategy to address these kind of the blurring of lines after these events? And then the final area to kind of touch on regional states and is Lebanon, and in particular how the reordering of Syria's politics will impact the Lebanese political environment. How will the alignments with Hezbollah, with the Druze community, within the Christian community? And I think that importantly should as well be considered as this conflict deepens. Already there were reports last week of a Syrian fighter jet attacking within Lebanese territory. And those are already the fighters both for and against the Assad regime going forward. But I think that the political stability of Lebanon will increasingly be tested as these events go on. I think there was some, the experience of the Civil War at least made events such as these not as vulnerable, since the recognition within different communities within the Lebanese political environment that what comes next, they experienced what comes next in case of Lebanon in the 1970s. So of those states, so when thinking about crafting kind of a multilateral policy response, really starting to think about the regional relations. And I think we touched very much on Israel in the morning, and then equally so Turkey. But that's, those are some general points, but we can.
Thank you. Let me put a question to the panel, and then I would like to invite Ed to, if you have later anything to add to the discussion. My question is really, what is going to be the future of the Alawite in Syria? Are we going to see them being slaughtered? I mean, whoever is going to broker a peace needs to do that, you know, to figure out what the future of the Alawite is going to be. Fred?
Yeah, I think this is an extraordinarily important question. If you look at the strategy and the tactics applied by the regime from the beginning, as soon as Bashar al-Assad either made the decision or simply allowed to happen an overwhelmingly violent response to peaceful demonstrations, he inevitably put the country on the path to what would ultimately become a vicious sectarian fight, largely sectarian. Now, there are still broad elements of the mainstream opposition trying very hard not to take this bait, but it's becoming extraordinarily difficult, and the reason for it is rather simple. If you take a Syrian army and other armed elements, intelligence organizations and so forth, if you start with a number of 300,000, if you boil that number down first to actual combat units or combat-like units, infantry, armor, artillery, boil it down further in a sectarian manner, because at the end of the day, the only real elements that this regime could count on to do some of the truly vicious things it's done are units dominated by members of President Assad's own minority. These are Alawites. So what Assad has managed to do is implicate, if not incriminate, the entirety of his own community in his strategy for essentially preserving a family business. Now, the fact is that the vast majority of Alawites in Syria, we're talking about 10 or 12% of the population, have had absolutely nothing to do with these tactics or this strategy. Okay. Nevertheless, they have been implicated. Do I anticipate circumstances where there could be widespread campaigns of extermination? No, frankly, I don't. Will there be vengeance killings? You bet. I mean, this sadly is unavoidable. But it's an extraordinarily important question, and it's one of the things, frankly, that drives some examination that I think is going on about the possibility of a post-Assad international stabilization force of some kind that can work with a new Syrian government to basically, move into some of the sensitive areas and play a role in protecting vulnerable populations. And it's not just Alawites. I mean, if this thing continues along this path, you have, for example, in the city of Latakia, which is often thought of as the Alawite capital. In fact, this city is a majority Sunni Muslim, so there are people vulnerable there as well. Assad has really sprung open the gates of hell in turning this into a sectarian fight.
Just very briefly, I think the Alawites are more vulnerable than any of the groups in Iraq, for example, because there you have a 40-40-20 break. The Alawites are 12-13%, and they're smaller, and as Fred rightly says, they don't have a territorial break that is as convenient or as neat or as defensible as you do among the communities in Iraq. And I think we don't know the answer to that question, because the longer this goes on, the greater the dangers. There'll be not only vengeance, but really widespread slaughter, and perhaps in pockets. But there's been a lot of talk about this idea of a Alawite stand in the Northwest, and I find that doubtful. I just don't think that's something that is viable militarily at this stage, is acceptable politically, and just physically doesn't work.
Kind of building on what Robin said, based on kind of our economic assessment of this kind of creation of an Alawite rump state, if you look very much predominantly on grain as one commodity, they predominantly rely on that for the north part of the country. And if you look at the level of infrastructure development in terms of power plants and et cetera, the development is just not there at the moment to sustain a Alawite rump state. And I think there's, as well, from discussions with senior members of the Alawite community, whether that is even an option that can be really is something they really want to pursue at this moment.
There is a mic here if you want, please. Thank you.
I'd just like to ask a question to the panel. There's one group we have not discussed, and there's been a very dramatic announcement made in the last 48 hours of the agreement between the PKK and the Turkish government. And the Kurdish element in Syria, of course, is a very important part of this multi-confessional mosaic. And several of you have had experiences, I know, like in Iraq also, where you have basically a provisional Kurdish state operating with quite a bit of autonomy and with resources. And now all of a sudden, this historic agreement after 30 years between the PKK and the Turkish government, if it does move forward, what do you think the implications of this are going to be for the situation in Syria? Because this is something that I think can be a catalytic force for, and I don't want to be too dramatic about this, but if the Kurds move toward autonomy, this in itself can cause repercussions within Syria to break up this very fragile, it's become a very fragile multi-confessional system. So your comments would be welcome on it.
I'd love to take that one, because I'm actually in the process of writing a piece that looks at the fact that the Sykes-Picot Agreement that created the borders of the modern Arab states has begun to erode. And it's reflected, whether it's first and foremost in Syria, and the fact that whether it's the Kurds having a natural alliance in a way that 10 years ago or 5 years ago, even when there was the talk about the breakup of Iraq, a lot of us thought no, because there were too many incentives in terms of oil revenues and the difficulty of being landlocked and so forth, and not having partners to create a greater Kurdistan, that the Kurds were then willing to stay inside Iraq. Now with this kind of arrangement and a more natural pull, and plus the Sunnis in Iraq, in Western Iraq, being so active against the Shiite-dominated government in Iraq, and feeling with tribal links that cross that border that there's a much larger alliance among the Sunnis of Western Iraq and Eastern Syria. And so that it's very interesting to see how these borders may change, and whether it's actually the breakup of areas or the de facto new entities that emerge in a place like Libya, the breakdown, the idea of whether it's decentralization or federation or soft partition or something, that across the region you're beginning to see these sources of identity play out in ways that we didn't anticipate, even at the height of the trouble inside Iraq. And so I think you've identified a really important trend, and one that we really need to think about, because a lot of our solutions are based on the status quo in terms of what is the nation, what is the entity that will come out of this. And we may need to begin to think a bit more imaginatively about what's next and how this natural coalescence, I mean, after all, the Soviet Union broke up, Yugoslavia broke up, Sudan broke up, what are these natural alliances that may begin to unravel Sykes-Picot?
Fred, do you want to add anything? No. Andrew, do you have to add anything to this?
Well, I just have a very brief sentence. I think from my discussions with those working with the Kurds to try to get them into the coalition, I think that particularly the emergence with Talabani and Barzani, I think that really to have a solution on the Kurds in Syria, there's going to have to be more sustained engagement with Barzani on that, or there is that risks.
From what I hear from Iran is that one of the concern of the regime is also, what if there is a breakup in Syria, and what if the Kurds just, break up? What will happen to the Iranian Kurdish population also? Because so far they have had very good relations with Kurdistan. I mean, they have flexed their muscles showing it, but they are very concerned, and I think one of the reasons support of Assad is that they don't want to see a breakup of Syria, precisely the repercussion of having a Kurdish entity, the repercussion on Iraq and then on Iran. So, that's one of the concerns of the Iranian, but nobody pays any attention to that aspect of the Iranian involvement.
Yeah, and if they're worried
Syria.
about the Kurds going their own way, they perhaps shouldn't be supporting Assad.
Well, they owe it, I think, to him, or at least that's how they calculate this. I'm going to open the floor to questions. I think in the middle and then in the back, but there is a microphone here. Maybe we should ask you to come and ask your question here.
Fred, we can hear.
I think they can come here and ask them.
We can hear them. We can hear them.
But can you hear them?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Then you can speak loud.
I'm curious. You constantly mention the Assad government. My question is, what happens, and I'm serious about this, if Assad is assassinated? What happens the day after he's assassinated to both his government and also what happens to the opposition?
In Syria, you have a system where all significant governmental powers rest with the presidency and with subordinates of the presidency. The Syrian government, in the sense of a prime minister and a cabinet of ministers, is a collection of order takers for the family business. So I would presume, and I'm always asked the question, how long is all of this going to take? And my standard answer to it is, if I were to wake up tomorrow morning to the headline that Bashar al-Assad is blown up, I wouldn't be surprised. If we're having a discussion like this 6 months from now, a year from now, I wouldn't be surprised. There are any number of things that can happen here. I would assume that if Bashar al-Assad is assassinated, some kind of authority will devolve, or there will be an attempt to have the authority devolve within his family. Okay? I mean, we're not talking about the passage of power to one of the so-called vice presidents of the republic or anything like that. But I think the disappearance of Bashar al-Assad would be rather significant. Not necessarily the end of the story, but rather significant. Because to the extent he enjoys some degree of legitimacy, at least among his followers, it's because he was the designated heir of Hafiz al-Assad. Nobody else has that advantage.
One point, Alan, and that is that you've had no place is safe anymore in Syria, no place. Last month there was a bomb at Ba'ath Party headquarters that killed 53. Yesterday there was a bomb at a mosque that killed the top Sunni cleric allied with the regime, and 49 died. There is a sense that they're tremendously vulnerable. Assad's brother-in-law, married to his sister, was murdered, I think, last year in a bomb, stunning bomb that I think killed the interior minister too. Anyway, it was quite devastating in its impact. So there is the danger that there is some surprise. Whether they can get to him, who knows? That's why I think we were surprised that he's actually appeared twice in public in the last week or so, because he's basically been hiding out. The key is, Fred's right, that they'll look first, whether it's to Maher, his brother, who's head of the fourth battalion, Fourth Armored Division, right? Is one option. I think the key question really becomes then the military, and because the military is the instrument, and we've seen in surprising ways in the Arab world how, whether it was the Egyptian army turning against Mubarak, which none of us, could believe. Tunisians, again, realizing that the cost-benefit ratio for them was to move against. And it may be that Assad offers the excuse. And the fact that they're now appealing for people, for recruits. The clerics are calling on Sunnis to join, calling on Christians to join. There's pressure. Christian families are leaving because they're afraid their sons will get recruited even though they're paying the government, so they don't have to serve. So it's the key really in that, if there is that kind of sudden turning point, is what's the mood of the military or the military leadership? And this is where you may see divisions within those who are Alawite and fear, if they see that they suddenly become, what happened in Iran. You just kind of wipe out that generation of people who were sympathetic. And then the Sunnis who may say, it's time, we've got to move on. So what happens in the military, to me, is the key development.
Of course, what happened in Iran was that the army announced its neutrality and the whole system collapsed. There was a question in the middle.
And then they were slaughtered.
Yes.
I was going to say a quick point. I heard from someone who is in contact with Maher at the moment that when Bashar goes to sleep, Maher stays up all night. So it's kind of and I think on that question of can the military successfully mount a military coup, I've asked that to members of the Assad family, number of senior officers. I don't think that there's still about 70 core senior Alawite officers that you would have to remove before they go against the al-Assad family. So I think there could be a break from some of the more senior Sunni generals, but you still have a core generals who are not powerful enough on their own and too dependent on the president to ever launch their way forward.
Just speak loud so the panel can hear.
Sure. So I have two questions, actually. The first for Ms. Wright. There was an interesting article also in The Atlantic a couple days ago, basically calling on us to stop calling this a sectarian conflict, saying that we're perpetuating the problem by continuing to call it that, and by saying that Syrians, for the most part, identify themselves as Syrians. Is that a problem? Should we start holding back a little bit on that? So that's my first question. And to Ambassador Hoff, what distinct steps do we need to take to form this government on the ground? Will electing a prime minister from Texas be the correct step?
That should do it, actually.
is it going to be
a lot of
like the
allies.
SEC?
Why don't you take the last question?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's this to me is the most difficult challenge of all, because this is going to be a rather labor-intensive process involving the United States and its closest partners on the Syria question. You know, you've got this Friends of the Syrian People group, which consists of something like 100 countries and different organizations. There is a core group in there that I think the United States probably ought to focus on in terms of organizing some kind of a standing body in Cairo to work with the opposition to make sure it has what it needs to succeed on the ground. Now, a lot of this work has to be done by the opposition. I mean, let's be honest here. We can't do it all. You have the Syrian Opposition Coalition. You have the military command. You've got local committees. Okay, this is not something that's going to be run out of a hotel room somewhere. Now, and the other thing is that you are not going to have members of this prospective government essentially committing suicide, you know, announcing their presence wherever, Aleppo, Idlib, wherever, because there has been a pattern to the way the regime operates in circumstances like these. Whenever a city neighborhood or a town is lost to the Free Syrian Army or someone else, the immediate reaction is indiscriminate artillery and sometimes air attacks on those populated areas. So these folks are not going to go in and proclaim a government on Syrian territory unless they have some assurances from the United States and others that they'll be defended. Okay. I mean, that is the essential part. And as I mentioned earlier, American leadership, again, within the Friends of Syria context, in rounding up resources that these folks are going to need actually to govern on the ground and to show some near-term successes. This is incredibly difficult. Nothing I'm describing here is the equivalent of the writing of an essay or an op-ed. And this is really going to test the operational capabilities and the organizational capabilities of our folks in government. There's going to be nothing easy about this.
I want to address that one too, because it makes me incredibly nervous when this is not Iraq. We don't bear responsibility for Syria. And I think the very idea that we're conferring legitimacy on an predominantly exiled group, you know, is tremendously dangerous. Once we're involved, once we're in, there's no out until it's done, or until we can't pay the price anymore. And I don't think the public mood is to support another Iraq or Afghanistan. And the fundamental problem is we're very good militarily at achieving our objectives, and we're really lousy at nation building. We don't know how to do it. We try to take control of the process, when in fact the real message of the Arab uprising was not that they want other Iraqs, but that they wanted to seize the control of determining their future. And I think the more we get involved, the less credible the opposition, the exiled opposition, or the SNC is. So the idea of a prime minister from Texas, man, with all due respect to Texas, and this is also not, you know, unlike Libya, where you had a government in exile in Benghazi, or a government, alternative government in Benghazi. It was inside the country. It had legitimacy, even if not complete national identity. On the issue of a sectarian conflict, I think this is where the media plays a kind of destructive role, because we go for labels and we simplify. It is true there is a Syrian identity. This is where you get into what is their first source of identity. Do people think of themselves first and foremost as Syrian or Christian or Druze or whatever? And I think among a certain class and in level of education, urban centers and so forth, you may find more of a nationalist identity than you do elsewhere. This is a problem, across a lot of countries. But, most of us probably think of ourselves first and foremost as Americans, and then we are either male or whatever our religious is, or graduated from whatever university, depending on where you stand in the NCAA, basketball standings. That, there are, and I'm not sure we're there yet in Syria. And so the idea, it's not a sectarian conflict. It isn't. But it has sectarian dimensions. And the big question for all of us, going back to Ed's question, is there a Syrian identity that is strong enough to hold a country unnaturally created by the French and the British together? And we don't know the answer.
May I just say 2 words about the Prime Minister from Texas before we take this too far? I would just like to say that the person in question, Hassan Hitto, is a highly respected member of the opposition, and he is Syrian, and his selection involved no input, zero input from the United States of America or anyone else. This was a decision made by the Syrian opposition coalition. This guy has served as, for all practical purposes, a one-man assistance support unit in the coalition. He has been absolutely essential to getting critical supplies into the country to the right people. Why he was elected now, I have no idea, but that may be part of the reason, is that the opposition understands that unless it can play a critical role in delivering support to the people who need it, its own credibility will suffer enormously. Hitto himself is a tremendously capable guy. What he needs to do is build a system within that opposition that goes beyond his own personal capabilities.
Oops. Let me take two questions at the same time, because we are running out of time. Yes, and then the lady. But brief questions.
All right. You haven't mentioned the jihadis, Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra. Is that because you believe they're not significant? I read that they're well-armed and well-trained and significant in the fighting now. If you think they are a factor, could you talk about that in two senses? One, in the immediate military issue of fighting, and ultimately the post-fighting situation.
I would like to ask a humanitarian question. You talk about arming the Syrian government, the resistance, what the horrors that are going on there. Is there any way for the United States to take a more active role in helping, like Turkey with their problems with 4 million, and also certainly Jordan needs help, assuming responsibility of a passive nature and not with guns, but to go, and we have a wonderful doctor, because there seems to me that a lot of we could do in the humanitarian to palliate that situation.
Andrew, you want to go
Sure.
first, and then
On the 2 topics, I'll briefly address the humanitarian aid, because I think that is an important point. But to remember, the United States is the largest donor of humanitarian aid. It's to the UNHCR through UN agencies, and as well with so there definitely is that focus, and our assessment details that, and so does a number of writings do. On the jihadists, I think it's a very important question. But to keep in mind, I think the numbers probably, estimates range from 5 to 20%. I've heard a number of different figures, is a serious challenge. And I think it goes back to the whole question of, as you raise, fighters who are better armed and have better access to resources often do better on the battlefield. And I think the question then is, how do you sap that support and support the moderate forces in the FSA militias and so forth that do support the more wider objectives of, importantly, the Syrian National Coalition? Because I do agree with Robin that this has to be an organic process. And the more those linkages between the FSA militias and the SNC happen organically, that will bring a stable, secure transition.
There were two questions. Can you answer it when you take these two questions?
I just want to make a quick comment in response to what Ms. Wright said. I don't think we should be distracted by the fact that the new prime minister is, lived for a long time in Texas. I know him in person. He's as Syrian as it can get. And I think this confusion stems from the fact that people are still not sure about the function of this new interim government. Mr. Ito was selected because of his vast managerial experience and because he has proven to be a success, administering or managing the assistance coordination unit within the Itilaf, or the National Coalition. And the purpose of this new interim government is mainly to administer the liberated areas inside Syria and coordinate, aid into the country. And according to the current structure that the opposition is, Mr. Muaz Khatib continues to be a more powerful person than he is. Now, keep in mind that this new national coalition has 14 seats from the 14 different governors in Syria, people from inside the country. And just
I'm sorry, your question, because we really are running out of time, and there is one more question.
One last one, because it's important. And also keep in mind that the opposition in Syria is not only about the national coalition. Across the liberated areas, you have people either through elections or consensus building. They're organically forming councils. And I just came from Syria, where I monitored the first major democratic elections in 50 years, the election of the Council of the Aleppo province, and the Itilaf was working with them. So that organic effort, the question is, I don't think is, whether or they're Shalabis or not, but the question is whether there will be robust support to the organic or to the opposition or to the national coalition or not. Thank you.
Thank you. The back, please. Yes.
Well, the crisis in Syria has been now 2 years, and it is really fair to say, to question our administration intention in finishing the issue of that crisis. And the reason I say that is they tell us that Iran is national threat to our national security, and Hezbollah is a terrorist organization that destabilizes the Middle East. And it seems to me now that not helping the Syrian in a real way on the ground is just a way to exhaust Iran and Hezbollah and even Russia on the expense of the Syrian people. That's number one. Number two, I'm very discouraged by hearing that some of the Free Syrian Army generals that some of the panelists spoke to, saying that this conflict, nobody will win it. Well, maybe nobody will win it if we don't arm properly the FSA. If we arm them, for anti-aircraft missiles, then it will be over. As a matter of fact, that even will support the political process, because then Assad is under pressure.
Thank you. I'll give the word to all three panelists. That would be your last comments and answering the questions. And let's start with you, very brief.
Sure.
You can, and then Robin, and then Fred, you after that.
I think the important point about the local elections in Aleppo are very important. And I think if that trend continues, and if that does lead to more of a weight on the ground to the political civil society groups are able to be the representative voice instead of different local armed militias, and those FSA militias do back those councils, it's a very positive step forward. And then just on the points about whether on the FSA commanders, on the arming, I think that I still believe that the military balance, you can't easily solve the military balance just purely by providing anti-aircraft weaponry. I think that more advanced weaponry has gotten in, and it still has kept the military balance at times about the same at the moment. It may change with more flow of weapons, but I don't think that alone is really the outcome one wants if we want a stable Syria in the future.
The head of the Pentagon.
Okay, very quickly, on your point about arms, the United States is still buying back parts, not complete, but parts of Stingers that we provided to the Mujahideen in fighting the Soviet Union, which ended in 1989. You know, there are dangers, particularly in providing man pads, as they're called, you know, anti-aircraft material to Syrian forces who might sell it from one militia to the next and end up, you know, being used against Israel. That's a non-starter for the United States. I just don't think it's going to happen. In terms of the internal leadership, this is not personal against Mr. Hito. I don't know him. He may be the best man to run Syria down the road. The fact is he's been in Texas, and this is a time when the people who fought inside, who've lost brothers, uncles, fathers, sons, feel that they want to have a role in the future and be the ones to determine it, not a group of... This is a lesson we should have learned out of Iraq. And as I said, this is not personal. In terms of the humanitarian question and al-Nusra, they're both related, and that's the dirty little secret of 2 years of Syria, and that's the corruption. And it is rampant in the north. And a lot of the aid is not getting to people in Aleppo and other cities that really need it, because whether it's the mafioso, tribal mafiosos taking it to sell it, whether it's people diverting it, that it's a really chronic problem. And so one of the attractions of al-Nusra and some of the jihadis are that they have not only the discipline, but the kind of moral commitment, at least at this stage. They're perceived that way. And there are some, because they have better arms, and because they're not involved in the kind of the dirty business, that there are lots of anecdotal stories of people who've gone to join them to fight because they think that they have more of a chance to make an impact, even though they're not jihadis themselves. And so it gets into, you know, and frankly, I think what the U.S. has given in terms of humanitarian aid is a joke. We may be giving more, but I bet we're not giving more proportionately than other countries. We always give more in terms of foreign aid because we're just a larger country. But when it comes to proportionate aid, foreign aid generally, we give less than any other country. And I suspect if you compared it, that it wouldn't be, you know, we'd be somewhere along that line. 155 million total for all those refugees just knocks me out.
Very briefly, Mr. Hito does have a son on the front lines in Deir ez-Zor. I think he's paying his dues. Saeed, thank you for your question. Whatever the shortcomings of our policy, I do not think it involves a grand strategy to exhaust Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. Yeah. In terms of arming the Free Syrian Army, I am not opposed to it in principle, provided we know who gets what. I mean, some of the bad guys in Syria are getting support. I could start with the Assad regime and move right onto the Nusra front. But the question is much broader than arms. It's a question of the relationship. There may exist a sufficiently sophisticated and efficient international division of labor that could preclude arms coming from the United States. It may be that our focus would best be on intelligence, training, and other forms of support. Nobody in this scenario, nobody, not even Senator John McCain, will support any kind of a development leading to American boots on the ground in Syria. That's completely off the table. And if we're talking about no-fly zones and things of that nature, one thing that I do think planners may have to take into account is the possibility of using cruise missiles and things of that nature to eliminate aircraft on the ground, rather than pumping man pads and other kinds of systems into the country.
Thank you very much. You're going to continue this discussion later with Ambassador Jerekian and Ambassador Ford, because Syria is also part of the Arab Spring. So please join me in thanking the panel.
That was fun. Thank you. You did great. You're great moderator.